All right, y'all, here we go. So now we're going to we're going to continue talking about families from Middle Eastern backgrounds, and we're picking up at page 193 of your book, Multicultural Students with Special Language Needs, Practical Strategies for Assessment and Intervention, 5th edition by Dr. Celeste Roseberry-McKibbin. So this is chapter 9. We're going to, like I said, we're going to pick up on page 193, which starts us out talking about attitudes about healthcare and disabling conditions. All right, so one of the things that if you've paid attention to the world at all over the course of your lifetime, you know that wars and armed conflicts are an ongoing issue in the Middle East and in North Africa, and that these things affect some countries more than others, but in general, in the war-torn countries, there are thousands of children that die and have died from inadequate health care, the politicalization of starvation with the people in power limiting access to food and resources to certain regions, which is what embargoes on food are, and other war-related problems. This has particular impact on not only children with disabilities who we would come in contact as speech-language pathologists, but with children in general. And there you go. So one of the other things in the Middle East that is actually really prevalent is the presence of hearing loss. In fact, it's 2 times as common in Middle Eastern countries than it is in other areas of the world. There is, in some regions, not all regions, but in some regions, there continues to be interfamilial marriage in order to hold on to territories that have been part of a particular tribe or culture for generations. Once, at some point over the course of generations, you run out of new DNA being introduced into family lines, and that tends to result in a lot of different kinds of syndromes, with hearing loss really kind of being one of the beginnings of, not to say that all hearing loss is, congenital hearing loss is related to interfamilial marriage, but there's a genetic component many times with congenital hearing loss. And there you go. And like I said, the interfamilial marriage can have, think about the Russians and hemophilia back during the reign of the czars. This is not actually new to human history. One of the other things is that reporting of disabilities is actually lower than it is in European countries. So even though the statistic I am sharing is that their hearing loss is 2 times as common, it actually may be a greater number than that due to access to reporting or interest in reporting. It's likely a higher number than what we think it is. All right, I actually, several years ago when the website ResearchGate first started getting really popular, my work with the kids in the oral preschool program at ODU, or our team's work, got the notice, or a geneticist, an epidemiologist from, oh no, Pakistan reached out to me as a potential collaborator because he said that hearing loss, he actually was talking to me about the fact that hearing loss is so prevalent um, in the healthcare system in where he lived and where he works. So that was kind of an interesting experience that happened long before I actually started teaching this class and came across this particular statistic. All right, so disability and comes with a huge degree of shame and guilt, especially for mothers. In many Middle Eastern cultures, they become, female children in particular who have disabilities are much more likely to be isolated than male children with disabilities. Remember in the first set of slides, I said that male children are preferred because overall, they are less of a financial burden to families in their lifetimes and actually have a greater potential to, sorry, I'm gonna allergy cough. I promise I'm okay, hang on. There we go. Have the potential to actually bring income to their families, whereas female children in general are seen as requiring more income and resources from their families. So when you have a female child with a disability, you've now exponentially increased the level of burden because being able to find a suitable marriage for a child with a disability is obviously tricky anyway, and becomes even trickier when you have a child with disability. So some of the reactions may be denial. In fact, it works out better for families to be in denial for as long as humanly possible, so that they may have the potential of finding a match for their child before the disability becomes particularly apparent. Isolation, keeping the child in isolation or the family in isolation actually is very common as well. And sometimes when resources are particularly scarce or shame is particularly high, children with disabilities will be abandoned by their families. Families of children with really serious mental disabilities sometimes may only be able to interact with their own families because the families will not take them out in public. And extended family may or may not visit once the disability becomes known. All right, so one of the takeaways from this is that, and one of the things that I have often thought as a highly privileged American myself is that one of the ways our privilege manifests is in having the kinds of resources that we tend to, and to be able to take care of people with disabilities. In the US, we have services in place. We have federally mandated services available for people with disabilities, especially children with disabilities. So even though there may be a great deal of guilt and shame that comes from being a parent of a child with disabilities, in our society, we do have the availability of resources to help care for children with disabilities. So if you consider that in several of the Middle Eastern and North African countries, there are not a lot of resources to go around, especially in war-torn regions, having a child with a disability becomes not just a theoretical source of shame, but actually can be a source of financial hardship and resource management that families are not able to actually cope with. So whereas it is certainly horrifying to consider any child being abandoned by their families or anybody else, it is, at least in my mind, a lot more understandable how it could happen when you consider how little resources are available to everyone as a general rule, and certainly to a family in a culture where having a child with disabilities is a huge source of guilt and shame. All right. So let's move on, and we're going to talk about communication styles, because that's the next thing that comes in our chapter. And we'll go from there. All right. So communication styles. Loud is proud and strong. I was actually walking towards the intersection of Hampton Boulevard and 45th on my way to my car one afternoon, and I saw two young men of who knows what I would guess to be Arabic descent, actually having a very loud conversation. And you could tell it wasn't an argument, it was just a really loud conversation. And once I started teaching this class, I think I was already teaching this class at the time, I was like, oh, you know what? They're just expressing their opinions passionately. And I think that, again, that's the power of this kind of information. If you see we certainly have been biased and conditioned in American society at this point to try to perceive every brown-skinned, dark-haired man who could potentially be identified as Arabic as a terrorist. And so I think that if that is your incredibly biased perspective, seeing two men who appear to be of Arabic descent essentially yelling at each other on a street corner could be a really daunting thing. So now that you've had this class and you have taken advantage of listening to these slides, you know that really it's just a sign of passion about and conviction about what you're talking about. So there you go. Rapid is right. So for any of you that were on the debate team in high school or past high school, you're familiar with this. If you can, the more information you can pack into the smallest space of time, obviously the more correct, and if you can do it loudly, the more correct you are about what you're saying. One of the other things that is, I think, actually true around the world, but is particularly true in my stereotypical understanding of folks from the Middle East and North Africa, is that personal relationships are very key factors in business negotiation. In fact, if you don't have some kind of solid personal relationship with the people you're trying to do business with, odds are you will not be doing business with them. Okay, so direct eye contact indicates honesty unless you are a woman, and it is not appropriate for women to make a lot of direct eye contact. So bear that in mind. All right, and you may remember when we watched Trevor Noah's interview with Ilhan Omar at the beginning of the semester. I told you that his mannerisms and his way of interacting with her you could tell was a shift in the way that he usually does things to be culturally appropriate, because one of the things he did was not a long sustained eye contact with her, because I believe she's Ethiopian. In Ethiopian culture, again, it is not appropriate for women to have long sustained eye contact with men. So there you go. Verbal eloquence is very highly prized, and this is a way that you can help families believe in the necessity of speech language services. Is that one of the things that you are trying to help Precious Peanut with is achieving as much verbal eloquence as possible. So it may make your services feel more justified than if you don't include that as part of a reason to participate. Not always, just saying. It's one of those things to keep in mind. So one of the other things in Middle Eastern culture, Middle Eastern North African cultures, is that no is not a word that is really used. So my title of the slide is there is no. So indirect answers tend to be the mode of choice. So sometimes you'll get a God willing, or you may get another indirect style. So perhaps, or maybe, or things like that, instead of a very direct no. So direct answers are probably not going to be as easy to obtain. So just kind of keep that in mind. So the keep your legs to yourselves. It means that, we tend to have our own personal bubbles as Americans, and man, we just made them bigger with COVID-19. But there are a lot of cultures where that is not the case. In fact, most Middle Easterners will stand or sit very close to other people. So just be aware that your bubble may be too big for your Middle Eastern friends or Middle Eastern clients. In fact, 2 feet is usually the more typical distance. Titles and last names are used very often. Be aware of where your feet are, because again, it's that, having your feet facing someone, the soles of your feet in particular, indicates that you feel like you are, they are beneath you. Okay, so there you go. If you're talking to someone of the same sex, again, feel free to sit very close to them. If you are talking to someone of the opposite sex, then that's very different. You need to maintain respectful boundaries. All right, so there is a great table in your book. It's on pages 196 and 197, and it talks about the articulation and language differences that you may notice among Arab speakers, or, yep, there you go. So one of the things that I want you to do is to be sure that you review that particular table, really as a speech language pathology student, and as someone who hopefully will become a speech language pathologist. these are the kinds of things that you're really going to want to know and hopefully remember when you are working with people, because remember, we don't want to diagnose something that is a dialectical difference as a disorder. So pay special attention to the language characteristics with things like omission of possessives or omission of plurals and prepositions and things like that. All right, I just included this particular table as the last slide because I thought it was really interesting, and the differences between the print and names of the letters of the alphabet across 4 different languages. So there you go. All right, next up, part 3.